a national dialogue on coalition governments will be convened today by Deputy President Paul Mashatile. The two-day event is meant to establish a national framework for coalitions. According to government, over 70 municipalities had coalitions since the 2021 elections. But, as we know, coalitions have turned chaotic in many areas, including Johannesburg. So what are some of the key factors to look into at this dialogue? Let's bring in Tessa Dooms. She is director at Rivonia Circle this morning. Tessa, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming on to the program. Not a new concept, coalition governments, going back as far as 1994 in many respects. So what changed in 2016 and 2021 at local government level to make coalitions such a contentious issue?
Well, as you said, Michelle, the 1994 coalition at national government, the Government of National Unity, wasn't an earnest coalition in that it was formed as part of a brokering of the peace agreement rather than the outcome of an election. We know that the ANC at national government level won 62% of the vote that year, and so they didn't need to share power had it not been for those negotiations. So what happened in 2016 is, and I would argue that even before 2016 at the local government level in some municipalities, you already did see some coalitions being formed. But in 2016, we saw it happen at the highest level we've seen, which is at the level of metros. The higher level indicates higher population sizes and higher budgets. And that's really where the rubber hits the road, because the bigger the budget at play, the more the contestation for power it would seem.
Right.
And also with that comes the kind of prominence of leaders in those spaces in order to build profiles, particularly national profiles. And so what you saw was two things play out. One was that the ways in which parties have been negotiating those coalitions have been very haphazard. And that's in part because of our political culture and in part because of the time frame in the law for setting up coalitions, but also very much based on positions rather than on principle or governance. And I think those have caused just a climate in which we have this being used as a political football in a very, I think, immature set of relations.
So when you talk about full positions, you're talking sort of tit for tat, right? Your party votes with me on something, you might be in line to get this position. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, more crudely, that people are horse trading to get the position that they want. Either a position that they want because it thinks will give them the most prominence, or the position they want because they think that will give them the most influence and use of a budget line in the way that they want. And that's become the primary way in which coalitions are forming. There is just simply no substantive conversation about stability, about delivery, about the issues at play, and about what the voters want. Because these people represent voters, particularly at council level. We forget that half of the councillors in a room at any time were elected through wards. They are ward councillors directed directly from those communities, unlike at national and provincial level where we only have the PR system. But our political culture is as such that even in the city of Joburg, where the ANC has about 90 councillors, only 4 of those councillors are actually only PR councillors that are elected through the party. The rest of them are ward councillors, but they behave as if they take their mandate only from the party, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah. You talk about putting things more crudely. Essentially, it's more about being closer to the money than it is about service delivery, Tessa. I mean, is that fair to say?
Yeah, closer to the money, closer to the power, closer to the influence, and closer to the eyeballs that it can attract from society.
So, I mean, in principle, on paper, coalitions can be beneficial, right? They can work to deepen our democracy. But because of all the issues you've just outlined, we're not seeing that. In fact, we're seeing the very opposite of that.
Certainly, and I think that it's not a question about whether coalitions are beneficial or not. We will get stuck arguing are coalitions good or bad. That's irrelevant. Coalitions are the outcome of an election.
Right.
And it is a legitimate outcome of an election that we must manage well, and those who have been elected must manage well. If we cannot manage coalitions, that is not coalition's fault. It is the fault of us as a society not managing it well. It's the fault of putting in people in power who do not have the desire to do the right thing, whether they're in coalitions or not. People should be able to persuade each other. That's part of politics. Persuade each other to find common ground. And the most common ground should be service delivery, the delivery of goods and services to the society that you represent. And our politicians have fallen short of that in many instances.
I mean, we obviously need this national dialogue on coalition governments, right? Given everything we've discussed now at the start of our conversation. I suppose the question becomes, who is part of putting together this framework for how coalitions should work? Surely they shouldn't be the people who are at the forefront of ensuring that they don't work.
Well, unfortunately, the people at the forefront of ensuring anything in this country are the legislators, which is a important reminder to all of us that who we vote into legislations, who we vote in as MPs, not as cabinet members, not as president. We don't get to vote for the president or cabinet. We get to vote for the members of parliament, in that we vote for parties to put together lists that go into parliament. And if we don't know who those people are, what those parties stand for, and the quality of the decision-making that will happen at legislation that represents us, that's a problem, because legislators will have the highest decision-making power when it comes to how coalitions are formed. So they can consult, which is commendable that they are consulting in the way that they are at this point. But ultimately, it's going to be the ANC caucus with its majority in parliament and MPs whose names we don't know, who are going to decide how this legislation or any legislation or rules or regulations around coalitions are formed, including other political parties who, as you rightfully say, have been part of the messes that have been made. And whether or not they're going to do what's in the public's interest, in the country's interest, rather than in their party's interest, remains to be seen. Their track record is not stellar on that account.
Yeah. Watershed elections next year. We've been singing that tune for some...
I think 2024 is comparable to 1994, because 1994 you had a new cohort of voters coming into the system that ultimately would change governance and would change the voting pattern. And here we have an opportunity of what I call the 28 million unactivated voters, 14 million registered voters who did not vote, for example, in 2021, and 14 million new voters in the system who've never registered. And I think that 28 million is going to be crucial about whether they show up or not in next year's election. Because if they do, disenfranchised, discouraged by the voting options, we don't know what their vote will be. But we know that their vote could significantly alter the balances of power, because political parties have become very complacent that the voting pool is only this small amount of people, be somewhere between 12 and 16 million people who are going to show up, and that they can count on how those people will vote. I think it's the unregistered voters and the voters that haven't shown up in a while that can really shake things up and make our politicians have to sweat and work for those votes rather than just mosey through one rally at a time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the bulk of those voters are young people, and the problem with convincing them to show up is that they don't see the correlation, right, between making their mark and having their material conditions change.
I mean, and that's a really important thing, because what young people must know is that in 2019, the ANC got 10 million votes that secured them their 57% in parliament. Like I said, that 28 million, even that cohort of 14 million, the majority, the large majority of which are people under the age of 30, those people could actually unseat the ANC if they voted even for a tree. So the numbers are in the favor of the voter, and that's what we must remember. And the numbers are in the favor of young voters. If young voters show up for themselves in any form, they will have the balancing sway of this election in 2024.
Tessa Dooms, Director at Rivonia Circle, thanks very much indeed for joining us this morning.